research is about the slut walk movement, where women went out to protest against slut shaming and victim blaming. And what I'm interested in actually is how women use both the physical space, whereby they went out in the streets to march in order to protest against women, first of all, being raped, then being blamed for their own rape and for the system letting them down. And what I'm also interested in is how they used online spaces to disseminate word about the protest, to try and recruit more supporters, to mobilize. And so for me, it's about that juxtaposition between online and offline. And I suppose there's also a question about the freedom that is afforded to women in online spaces, where they feel free perhaps from threats of violence, of aggression, or any other kind of physical threat, which sometimes sadly do exist in physical spaces.
Well, a lot of my research has been around sex work, which is interesting because obviously a certain amount of that entails women's use of public space in a way which is sort of explicitly sexualized. And it's interesting for me to have an opinion on that as an academic, and also then how that interrelates with my personal life. I was thinking, like last night I went out and I was on my bike and I was wearing a skirt, so there was legs on display, and I got some comments of some guys on the street. And it's difficult for me to process how I feel about that personally, because I have issues with it as an academic and a feminist. But at the same time, I thought, what will it be like for me when men don't notice me anymore, when actually I can go invisibly in public spaces because I've ceased to kind of be viewed as a sexual object? And when I actually in some ways find that just as upsetting, but for a different reason, as I do when I feel like I'm being objectified. And for me, it's sort of little questions like this about how me as a sort of person can interact with me as an academic, which I find problematic but also really interesting to explore.
My research focuses on women's use of sexual spaces. I've done research on women's use of sexual space in different national and cultural contexts. In Thailand, for instance, white female tourists are able to access and use public space in a way that they wouldn't in their own countries. So I'm particularly interested in how things around race and class and ethnicity intersect to regulate women's body in particular spaces. And with sexual spaces, I think there are certain instances, certainly where white Western women are able to consume and objectify the bodies of other women. So I think we really need to understand race and class in these kinds of conversations about public space and women's positionings in those spaces as well.
In my research, I've been really interested in the kinds of things that impact on the way women feel that they can use public space. And I think there are all sorts of different things that have that kind of impact. One is being put under scrutiny, so calling women sluts if they take over space or dress in particular ways. It obviously makes women very inhibited, scared, self-conscious. I think what can also make women conscious is the constant kind of background debate about what women should be doing or shouldn't be doing, or what feminists should be doing, what shouldn't be doing. I think actually it's not so much that women are constantly under the pressure to be sexy, they're constantly under the pressure to monitor themselves, to be sexy or not be sexy, to be not too quiet, not too loud, to constantly worry about what they're doing. I think the whole thing becomes, it really limits women's ability to take over and use public space, and I think it limits the way that feminism can experiment with public space, because women become too self-conscious about what they're doing.
Public space has been constructed with the exclusion of women, but over time women have fought for the right to be in those spaces, and sometimes they've used experimental techniques to force themselves to be in the space. So I'm interested in those experimental techniques. For instance, the suffragettes, they forced themselves into the House of Parliament, chained themselves to grills, chained themselves to statues. The Greenham Common women, they used cloth weaving to tie themselves to the industrial military complex. And women have built refuges, safe homes in the public realm so that they can flee domestic violence. And more recently, there's been a more spectacular taking up of public space with the slut walk or bands like Pussy Riot, and some really, really interesting experimentations with space. But most importantly, I think academics have written a lot of books on the right to the city. especially after the Occupy movement. I'm thinking of David Harvey's book, Rebel Cities. But the feminist take-up of space just doesn't feature in those male writings of how space has been made and remade and disturbed.